I'm Joanne Law, Director of Studies for Mediation Institute and co-founder of Interact Support. I'm on a mission to prevent violence by training and supporting dispute resolution practitioners. Mediation Musings is a series of conversations with mediators and for mediators. So if you're interested in dispute resolution, follow the channel. We're intending to update new recordings each week. Enjoy. Today I'm talking with Daniel Myers, who is a lawyer, a mediator, and has been on a really interesting journey. So thank you, Daniel, and welcome.
Thank you.
The other thing is that you're on our panel of lawyers, when I say our panel, for Interact Support, for referral through for legal advice and other support as well. So thank you as
no
well
problem.
for that. Tell me, actually, I'd really like to start with that journey that you've been on, a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, in terms of a journey, I suppose the first thing to mention is you will have picked up from my accent, I have been on a physical journey from England to Australia. So I moved here in 2007. At that stage, I was a newly admitted lawyer in England and had visited Australia a few years beforehand in my gap year, traveling. I really loved Melbourne. So I had this long-term plan to move here and eventually did so in 2007. And then I had to do a little bit of study, one semester at Monash, and then a year of being a law clerk before I was admitted to practice in Victoria. By that stage, I had decided that I was really keen on a career in family law. So I've been working in Australia in family law as a qualified lawyer since 2008.
Okay, so you basically just you liked Australia and decided to come. You just by yourself.
Yeah, well, that's it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I see it as the best of both worlds between what I enjoy about living in England, and I'm from Manchester originally. I've worked in Oxford for a few years as a trainee solicitor in England. Love London, but in terms of living there, it's there's various pros and cons. So yeah, Melbourne, I get a lot of the British culture, and in terms of ease with which you can become a legal practitioner. Obviously, it's not that much of a transition from England, but also the better weather, and the I'm really into sport, and all the culture that Melbourne brings, and I've been fortunate that in the decade or so since I've moved here, technology has changed so much so that the world's become a much smaller place. Even I think within the first year of me moving, Facebook kind of took off and the iPhone was released. So just those two things alone make it much easier for me to, have my career and my life here, but keep in touch as much as I like, back in England as well. So
no, you're quite right, and the world is becoming much smaller, a much smaller place than it used to be.
Yeah,
thanks to the technology. So. Family law. So you decided, and that's been your main focus area since
that's
you started. So I imagine when you started, it would have been traditional, going to court, that type of family law.
Yeah, I think the way if I sit back and think about my career progression for the first 5 years or so, I concentrated on building up my general technical skills and experience, including going to court as a junior solicitor, either doing the occasional appearance work or instructing barristers at a hearing, and just getting a feel for what a case looks and feels like from beginning to end, and making lots of mistakes on the way, learning as much as you can. It is certainly a steep learning curve. But as I became more experienced and as the responsibilities fell more on my shoulders to manage the client, and with moving to a particular firm that concentrated very much on collaborative law and mediation, I had a change of focus from thinking much more deeply about out of court solutions for clients, and also generally what the importance of the experience of the process for clients as much as the actual outcome. And so in the last 5 or so years since then, that's really what has led me down the path to eventually becoming a qualified mediator myself, and so on.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting distinction that you're making there, between or seeing process and outcome as two separate things in some ways, or not necessarily two separate things, but two very distinct parts. Because I mean, eventually there's going to be an outcome of some sort, some resolution for property and some sort of arrangements for children, but the way you get there can be quite diverse.
And I went to a seminar a few years ago with where there was a discussion about a PhD. A lady called Jill Howison had done a PhD, and I hope I'm not misquoting her, but I think the focus on her, or the conclusion of her PhD, was that the well, as I just said, the process of the actual family law dispute is often at least, if not more important than the actual outcome. And she explained that most people in their lives don't think in terms of percentage of assets, or they don't think of their relationship in fundamental terms, in purely in the number of nights that they have with the child. And that's kind of the problem when you're in a family law dispute, or it's certainly the danger that it can get reduced to those positional statements and thoughts. But actually, it is important to drill down a lot further and work out what the underlying importance of the client's relationship with their children, or they don't want 60% or 50% per se. It's actually what half of the asset pool, for example, represents about the relationship as a whole.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and sometimes it's about recognition, or sometimes it's about the amount they need to get a deposit to get another house. So without knowing that, whether it's that they feel like they're not, they're not being acknowledged if it's not above a certain percentage. Then we don't know that if they get enough acknowledgement, they might be able to shift on where they're stuck.
Yeah, it would be an interesting kind of experiment in some ways. So if you had, you couldn't do it in reality, but let's say you had a particular couple or client, and you presented them with a particular outcome that was less or more favourable, but on the less favourable outcome, the process was actually a lot more dignified, and they felt heard, they felt acknowledged. Whether they would choose that outcome, which on the face of it is less favourable than the alternative, which on the face of it they may have got what they want, but at the expense of how much acrimony, cost, stress, and all the rest. So
yeah, look, absolutely. And I guess that's one of the things with mediation, is that we're often going to be having a conversation about that sort of thing with clients, about, what's really important to them. Whereas, sometimes it can be just, it's assumed that it's going to be, the more you get of the pie, the happier you're going to be. But if there's going to be a guerrilla war continuing for the next 5 years, was that extra 50,000 really worth it?
Yeah, and what is interesting is that it's quite common for the clients I see to say to me, at least at the beginning, that they only want what's fair, and they do want the process to be amicable, and that the problem is with the other side. But it's a pleasant surprise when actually I do have a client who perhaps has a bit more insight and recognizes that there's two sides to the story, and they can be not quite understandably want looking after themselves and wanting the best that they can possibly achieve, and actually they are at least in some ways responsible to where they are at today, and they themselves are as much a barrier potentially to an agreement as the other party.
Yeah, it's really helpful when people have got that insight. Although sometimes with conflict, it kind of robs us of of vision, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right.
It's really easy to look out and see what people are, all the blame you can ascribe, but anything we do is totally justified, surely.
Yes, it's a common scenario.
And I guess is that why you've because you've continued your journey looking at the psychology side of things as well. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, I enrolled on a grad diploma of psychology at Monash, which I've just completed. So it's taken 2 years. It's
congratulations!
Thank you. So it's the equivalent of the first 3 years, effectively, of a psychology degree. And what drew me to that, really, I suppose I can trace it back to this change of mindset about moving away from the more litigious nature of family law matters to understanding what the value of process and and focusing on what's important to clients on a deeper level. So that for instance, in the firm I moved to, the traditional initial appointment was flipped on its head, whereas before I had taken care to get more detailed instructions about the detail of the property settlement and a detailed chronology and list of the asset pool and so on. There was almost no focus at the beginning on, well, okay, that's all very well, but how are you actually going to reach an agreement? Or there was an over focus in that traditional first type of appointment on giving advice or getting instructions about the substantive outcomes, and not enough about how you actually get there. So when I did move to this other firm, the focus was to get a broad brush understanding of what the issues are, so you have some perspective and some context, but the majority of the first appointment was taken up by trying to understand the dynamics of the relationship and the individual personalities, what the potential challenges were and opportunities to reach an agreement, and what the particular concerns of the client were, and so on. So that in itself is a psychological exercise in trying to work out why the parties are in dispute and how they can resolve their dispute in the most amicable way possible. So that, just to fast forward to enrolling on the grad diploma of psychology, I was already attuned to wanting a greater understanding of what the underlying science was about human decision making, and I think the description of psychology itself is the science of how we think, behave, and feel. That's right.
Yes.
So that was certainly part of it, and then also in more tangible terms, there is a huge crossover between the everyday practice of family law and psychology in terms of the impact it has on children who are subject to a dispute, and what's in their best interest from an emotional and welfare perspective, and of course the mental health issues that are very common in a family dispute as well.
Absolutely. Well, we know a lot more now about the effects of conflict on developing brains, and I'm sure that was. Oh, I don't know. Hopefully, that was something that was touched on in the course.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so there was a neuroscience topic I did where there was a discussion about something called the theory of mind, which when I did my mediation course, which was also about 2 years ago, I learned the concept of mentalizing, which I believe is defined as the ability to understand a person's own mental state and that of another person, that underlines their general behavior. And what I think a simpler way of describing it is it's thinking about thinking. And it's really what's actually, on a at its fundamental level separates humans from animals, that ability to actually put yourself in the shoes of the other person and to ask yourself why you're actually thinking in particular terms. And so that in a mediation context, that's very important, because that part of the brain that can in day-to-day life operate efficiently and effectively and make rational, non-emotional type decisions gets impaired in conflict situations. So in my psychology course, in this particular elective in relation to neuroscience, I did actually learn that what happens at a chemical level in the brain when a person encounters conflict, and how their ability to mentalize does then get impaired.
Yeah, which takes us back to that thing of why people get into blame, because they literally can't consider the other point of view if they're in that agitated state.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hardwired. It's a survival mechanism, and so as professionals, part of our role is to try and manage that process for them so that they are able to maintain, rational thinking and consider perspectives and all of that.
Yeah, and even I remember in the what we were taught in the mediation course is just tips for managing that. It can be as simple as just having a break. Just asking a client to just have a timeout, walk. Get a cup of coffee, walk around the block, get some fresh air, and revisit in 15-20 minutes time. And that in itself can just be effective, just to reset the particular circuits of the brain that were
yes. Too
charged at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And maintaining a calm and a kind of business-like approach to things. It's there's a debate. Some mediators think that it's fine for people to vent. I'm really not okay with it in my mediations, because I know what it's likely to trigger for the other person, particularly.
Yes.
So I guess it's being mindful of, what's the possible impact of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess one of the reasons why people do give up their autonomy and want to use the court, want someone to make a decision for them, rather than. I think it's one of the things as mediators, we support self-determination. But sometimes clients don't want that.
Yeah.
Have you got a thought about that?
Well, I mean, what's interesting as well is the crossover between the things we've spoken about and the fundamentals of negotiation, and some of the classic Harvard professor books of negotiation, like How to Get to Yes and so on. And one of my favorite books in that realm, going back however many years, is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And the theme of that is that people are fundamentally egocentric, and so in a negotiation you have to kind of recognize that to get I think there was a saying that negotiation is the art of the other person letting them have what you want, something like that.
So that's right. It's well, absolutely. So one of the people I'm doing a lot of work with is Bill Eddy from the High Conflict Institute, and he's got a technique called EAR to use when calming people. So empathy, attention, respect. Which is particularly helpful for high conflict people, because they go into that defensive reacting mode where they usually will either attack or go into avoidance and not want to engage. That's it, I'm out of here. Yeah, it is. I guess you could see it as stroking the ego in some ways, but it's calming them down and making sure that they've got they feel heard and they feel respected.
Yeah, and recognizing in a negotiation the difficulty of trying to impose solutions on the other person,
Yes.
because that goes to, well, for them to agree to what you're demanding, if you're doing in that fashion, it hits their own ego, and that's the thing that is the fundamental driver of most people's existence, is, you know, the importance of their own ego and making sure they don't lose face in any settlement compromise. So
Absolutely. So yeah, if we can focus on not positions but interest of what matters, keep things to a level of ambiguity where there's many ways to resolve the issues, you've got much more likelihood that you can come up with something that won't be seen as a loss of face or a loss.
yes,
Because that's the big problem. People don't want to lose.
yeah,
If we manage the process, then that's just not part of what it's about. In some
yeah.
ways, I guess. But you know, in others, like, so are you? So I know you're still doing legal work. You're a collaborative family lawyer as well.
Mm.
Sure, you're part of the collab groups down here in Melbourne. And are you doing mediation work as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned I qualified a couple of years ago as a mediator, and my focus at the beginning was, or one of the reasons I became accredited, was to upskill myself as a negotiator acting for a client, and as really just to give some extra credibility to the fact that I enjoy and practicing in a way that prioritizes negotiation and mediation as the default way of resolving disputes. It was less so about becoming an experienced mediator in my own right, but that is something that more recently I have actually had some experience of, and so far, you know, I've enjoyed it a lot. It's got challenges, but that's something I am now putting more of an emphasis into, actually be the actual mediator.
But even so, a lot of lawyers that train to be a mediator says that it helps them in their you know, lawyering, I suppose, or working with clients as well. So some of the skills that you learn as a mediator can certainly be applied in other contexts.
Oh yeah, well that's right, because mediation is just a facilitated negotiation, and so as part of the mediation training was to break it down to what the two clients' interests were rather than positions, and there's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't do that as a lawyer acting for one party. It's just as important to do that as a mediator. So.
Absolutely, and helping them prepare properly. Like one of our interns recently, she was telling me they went to a mediation, and the mediator it was a lawyer assisted one, but they, you know, didn't have some of the basics in place, like the valuations and things like that from the lawyer's side. So sometimes just those practical things as well of knowing what needs to happen so that you can actually try and negotiate a resolution on the day.
Yeah, that's right. I have actually prepared a checklist of things that clients should be aware of or have ticked off before they actually have the best chance of reaching an agreement at mediation. And it includes things such as, you know, making sure you've got the essential legal advice about what the ranges are and the likely outcomes, but also to understand what the client's own interests are and that of the other person, so they actually can actually think about their deeper interests rather than just the positions, which is too easy to do if without much thought behind it. So.
Oh, absolutely. So that helping, I suppose being a bit of a coach for your client before the mediation. So what do you think the other side's going to propose? What do you think's important to them? as you say, sometimes people aren't thinking about that without a little bit of prompting because they're so caught up in, whatever it is they're caught up in.
Yeah, and a very good question to ask is, what do you think their best case is, or asking a client, tell me what you think their 3 best arguments are, and that goes back to that theory of mind thing, which is forcing them to put themselves in the shoes of the other person and seeing it from their perspective, and and actually just doing that exercise as well reminds them that if they don't reach agreement at mediation, then ultimately they're likely to go to court, and in a court setting, it is effectively a competition. Ultimately, it boils down to who's got the stronger argument. So that's another useful tool of ways to help prepare clients as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point to raise, because in our mediation training we learn theory and we learn processes, but in some ways we need to turn that into questions, into things that our clients can consider, because it's no good saying to a client, what's your whatner and your batner? We need to say, well, what if you can't resolve things? What's the, what do you think's the worst outcome you could expect? And sometimes they're catastrophizing and they'll say, oh, I've got nothing at all. And say, well, if you talk to your lawyer about that, because that's probably not exactly, and if you're the lawyer, you might be talking to them, well, it's never going to be nothing, or very unlikely it'll be nothing, but this is the range. And I heard you mention before advising people about the range. That's a really important thing. Going to court isn't a precise science. There's not a formula. If there was, you wouldn't need a court.
I've actually just brought up an article I wrote. I'll just very briefly touch on it. The 6 critical things to have before seeking a family law settlement in the context of a mediation. So the first is being armed with legal information about what a fair, appropriate, or realistic outcome is and the strengths of weaknesses of the case. Number 2, having an understanding of your own needs, fears, desires of yourself and of your ex-partner. The third thing is to ensure you have an emotional support network from friends, family, and if necessary, a professional counsellor. Number 4, attack the problem, not the person. That's a line from the book I mentioned earlier, Getting to Yes. Number 5, if there's children involved, helping to shield them from any conflict as far as possible. And number 6, this would be easier said than done, but have the capacity to manage the conflict in a positive way. So, for example, recognize the other party's perspective as well as their own, focus on the bigger picture and don't get caught up in minor detail, communicate with the other party in a way that's constructive rather than damaging. And anyway, that's just a bit of a flavour for checklist.
That's great. And is it so that's on your website, is it, that article? Or
it's an article I wrote for the Jewish News about a year or so ago. So just as we were talking, I just
that's great. If you wouldn't mind, because when I post this podcast, we'll have a page on the Mediation Institute website that it's linked to as well, so I can put a link to that article and your social presence or whatever, if people would like to connect with you as well, because you've got quite an interesting breadth of knowledge with the law and the psychology and the and of course the mediation. So you mentioned that you're starting to get a little bit more into doing some of the direct mediation work. One of the questions I do like to ask is, do you have any hints or ideas for people that are starting out in the industry about finding your place?
So in preparation for today, I listened to an earlier podcast with a lady from South Africa, Varish.
Varish.
Yeah. And I think one of the first things she said was what I had in mind for this question anyway, which is I have been surprised by how relatively difficult it is to relay aspects of the conversation with the other party in a way that is accurate, but at the same time doesn't breach confidentiality, because as a lawyer I'm used to just relaying all details of the conversation I have with the other part. Sorry, if I'm speaking to a lawyer on the other side, and then I come back to my client, say this is the discussion we had, and obviously I'm much more cagey when I'm relaying conversations to the lawyer about what I've discussed with the client. But it is interesting in that I have to give a high level sense of what the other party is telling me and the nature of the discussions I've had, but at the same time in a way that preserves their confidentiality, and that requires thinking in very subtle ways and reframing things, and just you have to be pretty smart to get that balance right. And that's something that is I'm sure will come more naturally with experience, but it is more of a challenge than the one of the other fundamental tenets of being a mediator, which is not to give legal advice. That's relatively easy.
That's easier to dodge.
Easy to dodge, because it's just, you can take it. It's just a very passive thing, not positively not having to answer a question or being able to just say, well, that's really a question for your lawyer and so on, as opposed to actually having to carry the mediation forward, express the nature of my discussions with the other party. So
absolutely, and when you don't get it right, it's really difficult for clients. I've had them, they talk to me and say, well, I made a proposal and they were gone for about 20 minutes and they came back and said no. It's like, well, what? Which is really not carrying anything forward. What's the use in that? I tend to kind of check in with the client I'm with and say, well, what is it you want me to share back to the other other person? Give them so this is what I'm thinking of saying. Is there anything there you don't want me to?
A safe mechanism, if you've got if you had that discussion with the client, there's no danger in there's transparency over how and what you're going to communicate in the first place.
Absolutely, but I don't do a lot of shuttle. Where you're probably doing more lawyer inclusive work, are you? Are you tending to do that sort of work where the parties are represented at the mediation?
A little bit of both at the moment.
So we most of I mainly do family dispute resolution, and sometimes I do kind of mediator negotiation where they're with family violence orders or whatever. They're not directly communicating. So that's where you've really got to think, okay, what's in this package and what are the risks of saying the wrong thing. So
and another thing I've encountered as well is sometimes there is a lot of talk about having talks. It sounds a bit like the Middle East peace process, or trying to get that off the ground, where there's that much distrust about whether of the other party. There's not that much inclination to begin the mediation process while because if it all seems too messy, an agreement seems seems impossible and too far out of sight. But you do have to start from somewhere. So that's some of the experience I've had so far as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the job for us as mediators, for everyone in the industry, is really letting users of mediators know what to expect, helping to demystify it, because what we do is held, as you said, it's confidential, it's held in private. General community really don't know what goes on behind our closed doors. And often even if they've had experience, they've been in a mediation, they've got a sample of one to compare with.
Yes.
And it may have been a good experience, it may not have been, and that's kind of their sum total knowledge of what happens. So I think educating clients, some of that preparation stuff that you talked about at the before is really, really important.
Sure.
Yeah. So is there anything, anything else that you think is really important? So most of our listeners are mediators of one form or another, that you like to share or bring to people's attention?
There's nothing that springs
Jumps
to
out.
mind. But if anybody is ever interested in chatting to me about negotiations through the prism of Brexit, I'm the world's biggest Brexit nerd, and I've actually written a blog about negotiation and Brexit and bringing it back to some of the parallels with an actual family law dispute. So I'm more than happy to have a chat over coffee with somebody about that if they want.
That sounds very interesting. So it's it really is a bit of a difficult divorce, isn't it?
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Oh, yeah. So I imagine, yes, because you'd be you're kind of outside of it because you're watching it from here, but you've
that's right, from a safe distance. Yeah,
from a safe distance. But I'm sure you've got family and friends over there that are saying you'll never guess what's happened now.
That's right. Yeah.
You watched The Last Leg with Adam Hills.
Yes. He's a very funny comedian. Yeah, so it's very good.
Yes, he's been quite fascinated by it as well. No, that'd be interesting. So I'll definitely love to share a link to that blog post and read it myself as well. It's it'd be quite good.
Yeah, by all means.
No, that's wonderful. So so look, I'm just mindful of time. I guess we probably should think about wrapping up, but
Sure.
look, it's really it's interesting. I'm really quite interested in this journey that you've taken to really deepen your understanding of where clients come from. I think it's something that is really important and really valuable, and I've no doubt spills across all aspects of the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk about it.
Excellent. So, thank you once again. And as I said, excellent. So, thank you once again. And as I said, if you wouldn't mind sharing where you've got those posts, I'd love to share those out so that people can have a look as well.
Yeah, by all means, I'll send that to you.
Oh, beautiful.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this chat with Daniel. To access the blog post we talked about, go to mediationinstitute.edu.au and search for Daniel Myers.